Hey y'all, Travis Watkins here. Been talking about some IRS matters and how to take care of tax problems. And if you like what you've been seeing here on these videos, you will want to go check out my book at traviswatkinsbook.com, and you can download a free copy of all these things that we've been talking about. But I give you a little deeper dive on these videos, and today we're going to be chatting about IRS penalties and how to get them abated or forgiven, for lack of a better term. And before we get started, there's a couple of things that I wanted to talk to you about. This came straight from the IRS's website about penalties. They give you a little history lesson on these things. They say in 1955 there were approximately 14 penalty provisions in the Internal Revenue Code. That's not too bad. Now there are more than 10 times that number. With the increasing number of penalty provisions, the IRS recognized the need to develop a fair, consistent, and comprehensive approach to penalty administration. So isn't that nice? Translation: they used to use penalties at the IRS to kind of give you a slap on the wrist if you didn't get your taxes filed or paid on time. Now they've got a real comprehensive system to give you a little tougher slap on the wrist, or actually choke you into submission, I guess, if you fail to do something related to your taxes. So I guess the IRS is saying, they get it. It's a complex system, and therefore there's a need to have something in place for the IRS to forgive these comprehensive penalties when certain circumstances arise, which brings us to the two types of penalty abatement or forgiveness. And the first one is a really great one that you'll be interested in knowing about. It's the first time penalty abatement with the IRS. That is a thing, a program. And the second type is your garden variety, what they call reasonable cause type of penalty abatement analysis. All right? So let's break those down here real quick. The first time penalty abatement is a great one because if you've been good for, let's say, about 5 years as far as filing and paying your taxes on time, then the IRS is going to give you a break on the penalties and some of the interest. And what I'm talking about here, there is no such thing at the IRS as straight interest abatement, really, ever. So if you're saying penalty and interest abatement in an IRS context, you're kind of out of line there, because they're only going to get rid of any interest that accrued on top of the penalties that they might be forgiving for one of these two reasons. So back to the first time abatement. If you've been good, then they may give you a one-time shot, one tax period, or one tax year, as the case may be, for having kind of a hiccup, I guess, in the road, is how they look at things. And so here's the strict requirements of the first time penalty abatement. First of all, you've incurred no penalties for the 3 prior tax years. So no penalties there, which means just as of requirement there, you have filed and paid on time for the last 3 years. Therefore, you didn't have any penalties that would have accrued for the last 3 years. So 3 years of good behavior on that front. Second of all, you have to have filed all required returns or extensions. That's kind of a given, at least for the last 3 years, because you would have had penalties if you wouldn't have filed on time. But they're talking about all tax returns have to be on file, and this goes back to something we've talked about along the way here, and is detailed in my book, The Ultimate Survival Guide for IRS Problems, that you can pick up on traviswatkinsbook.com and get that for free. Download it. It's a recurring theme in all tax resolution, that in order to go hat in hand to the IRS and ask them for anything, in most circumstances, I'd say like 99.99% of them, you're going to have all your returns on file to start dealing with them, unless they've filed a return for you, and that's a whole different ball game. But for purposes of the first-time penalty abatement, you've got to file all returns to get talking to them about first-time penalty abatement under the strict guidelines of the first-time penalty abatement program. Third, you have to have made payment arrangements on all your outstanding debt as it stands as of the time that you make the first-time penalty abatement. Okay, so that means either one, pay all the tax, or two, get into some type of what I call collection alternative. That means a installment agreement, typically in this thing. It really wouldn't be an offer and compromise, because the offer and compromise settlement program, as we've discussed here before, doesn't really, it runs more on what you can pay within the timelines of the collection statute expiration date. So offer and compromise, probably not a big issue here. You wouldn't be combining this with a straight offer and compromise request, but you might be combining it with a request for a payment plan with the IRS. Okay, so those three strict requirements in order to get that 1 year of tax liability, penalties, and associated interest for that 1 year of tax liability, whichever one it may be. It should be the most recent one, to get that taken off. Those are the strict requirements. Now, I should point out here that even if you don't strictly qualify for these things, you should still ask for them nonetheless, okay? Because there's a plethora of times when the IRS may not look as close on the exact requirements there, and they may cut you a break anyway. So it's worth asking for, okay? So that's the first time abatement processes. In other words, a way to get 1 year penalties and interest knocked off without having to go into too much detail, without too many questions asked by the IRS, other than the answers to those three questions, whether you've had any prior penalties for the last 3 years, whether you've got all returns on file, and if you've made arrangements for the outstanding debt. The next type of penalty forgiveness or penalty abatement that we'll talk about is the more popular one. It's the one that happens the most, and that is the reasonable cause type of analysis. And this is really a very fact-driven deal with the IRS. Most of it is computer scored, and what that means is that they'll scan your request and for things that jump out, and there's a few pet projects that are more successful in the IRS fact analysis here for penalty abatement than others. And the first ones would be health issues. That's a very big one, and you always have to provide documentation here. But I love going down the list, the litany here, and these are all outlined in my book at traviswatkinsbook.com as well, of penalty abatement reasons or reasonable cause that we have obtained in the past for IRS penalty forgiveness. And here they are. Reasonable cause has been or can be my CPA or my professional caused the problem, and that happens from time to time. You get a mistake from your tax preparer, for instance, and that causes a penalty and liability to arise. So sometimes that can be reasonable cause. I was sick or in the hospital. That's another good cause because, as I mentioned, illness, health matters are important. They are a good, reasonable cause for getting rid of penalties. Another one is I lost my job. Another one is I've got a gambling problem, and I should point out that the IRS is less forgiving in places like Oklahoma where there's where the casinos and gambling is alive and well. So what you would have to typically show there, in addition to having a gambling problem, is that you have made progress, made steps to take care of that problem so that you're not essentially, in their eyes, gambling away the IRS's tax money. So in Oklahoma, what that means is you can show that you are self-excluding yourself from casinos, for instance. There's a document that you can sign with the casinos saying that you won't be on premises, and if you are and you're caught, then you could be held liable for trespassing. That is really about the only thing, other than a good long track record of staying out of the casinos, not getting those 1099 or W2G forms where the casino files on you saying that they've paid you out money, and the IRS looks at those and goes, well, we really shouldn't show much mercy on this person because they are gambling away their money that could be going towards taxes. Another good reason is I was broke. My home got foreclosed upon. I went through bankruptcy. That's another good cause. Creditors came after me. I had substance abuse problems. My kids, my family members were in the hospital during this time. I had depression. I'm unsophisticated and didn't know that I had to file or make enough to file as a popular one. And I should say the IRS is going to look at these types of things anyway in a penalty forgiveness analysis. They're going to make sure that you're not, like a CPA yourself or a sophisticated tax professional that should have known better in that process. Other reasons: I lost my tax documents in a fire, flood, some natural disaster, fill in the blank. I got poor IRS advice is another reason. Long story short, these things are all life events, life coming at us at warp speed sometimes, and things that happen to us, and you've got to show the IRS that something happened that caused you to fail to file and or pay. And the IRS will look at these on a year-to-year basis. So if you've got, for instance, 5 years of penalties and associated interest that you're looking at getting forgiven, the IRS is going to look at each particular year itself and apply that reasonable cause analysis to each individual year. I often say don't minimize any of your reasons here, because honestly, the things that I see going through sometimes on penalty abatement versus the things that should go through but don't are just really beyond any type of reasonable explanation sometimes. So long story short, don't minimize any of your excuses, your reasons. Just make sure that you have them segregated by tax year that you're going for on the abatement, and make sure that you have, as I mentioned, documentation for each one of those. If you have medical bills, I would do like summaries of medical bills that you can get, from your doctor's office to show, that you were incapacitated, or that you were in the hospital or going through something medically that prevented you from being able to file and or pay on time. Another thing in this process, if you're going through it on your own, you need to make a copy of of your request, and keep these things pretty short. I mean, there's no real form necessarily that you need to use to make this request. You just need to do a letter and send it to your local IRS branch or service center, and put what you're trying to do. Say that you're doing a penalty abatement for these years or this year, and put in your reasonable cause in that analysis. And I'd just break it down by tax year, and make sure that you have the documentation to go along with this. These things have a 50-50 shot, I would say. So, if it comes down to, should I do this or shouldn't I, a 50-50 shot in IRS terms is a pretty good percentage. So it is definitely worth a shot on these. All right. If you get a denial back on these, you should appeal them. You should tell the IRS that I want you to have a second look at my reasoning, and I'd like to appeal these things. Now, collection won't stop on any of these while you're making your request for a penalty abatement per se, but do a appeal if you have good cause, because stuff gets approved in the appeals process that doesn't get approved in the initial process, and again, the reasons for that are just there's just no telling. So do an appeal if you feel like you have a good grounds for getting the penalties forgiven based on what I'm telling you here. If you don't receive anything from the IRS in the way of a denial or an approval or anything, after about 60 days, I would say go ahead and resubmit the request. And these are probably one of the highest types of relief requests that get kind of lost in the shuffle at the IRS. If you send them in with your tax return itself, or overdue past tax return, then there's a big possibility that whoever's taking the mail there at the IRS is going to throw the return in the return analysis bin, and who knows what happens to the separate piece of paper that doesn't go into a nice tidy box there at the IRS. So they do get lost a lot. Don't sit there and just assume that it's being processed after about 45 to 60 days. I would say just go ahead and call them and or resubmit. All right. All these things and more are outlined in my free book, The Ultimate Survival Guide for IRS Problems. And you can get a free copy of that at traviswatkinsbook.com. Of course, if you'd like to speak with a tax professional right now about penalties and associated interest abatement, then please give us a call, 800-721-7054. All right. I really appreciate you watching these, and we will talk to you soon.